The day was heavy with dust, the kind that clung to skin and turned every breath into a scrape. The wagon rolled into the yard at dusk, and chained inside sat a woman with bruises around her wrists and a silence so sharp it cut through the noise of the horses. She didn't speak, didn't meet anyone's eyes, just sat with her back curved as if the weight of the world had broken her bones long ago. The rancher stepped forward, a tall figure with lines on his face carved deeper from years of solitude. His daughter clutched his hand, her small eyes wide, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Daddy, is she dying?" The man didn't answer right away. He only looked at the woman, her torn dress, the way her collarbones jutted like fragile wings, and he saw not death but a spark, buried, faint, but there. He ordered the chains removed, his voice firm enough to leave no room for question. When the iron clattered to the dirt, she flinched like an animal expecting a blow. "Not here," he said softly. "Not in my house." He gave her a dress the color of fading sky, simple but whole, and when she put it on, her hands shook as though the fabric might vanish. The daughter, bold in her innocence, tugged at her sleeve and asked, "What's your name?" The woman hesitated, her lips parting but no sound coming. It had been stolen from her long ago. The rancher saw the pain in her eyes and spoke gently, "You don't have to keep the one they gave you. You can start again." That night she slept in a real bed, curled up like she was afraid to stretch too far, as though comfort itself was dangerous. She woke in the dark more than once, gasping, clutching at her throat until she realized no one was there to bind her. Each time, the little girl's soft snore in the cot nearby steadied her trembling heart. Days turned to weeks, and she began to move through the house like a shadow slowly gaining weight. She learned to hold a spoon again, to brush her tangled hair, to laugh at the child's clumsy jokes, though her laughter was quiet, fragile as glass. The man never pressed her for the past, never asked about the scars on her back or the fear in her eyes when strangers rode past the gate. He only gave her space, work, and a name. Grace, he called her one morning, and she startled, then wept quietly into her hands because no one had ever given her something so simple, so hers. The little girl adored her, following her like a shadow, slipping her wildflowers, braiding her hair with clumsy fingers. Grace began to stand straighter, her shoulders less burdened, her voice returning like a river thawing after winter. She sang once while sweeping the porch, soft and low, and when she realized the man was listening, she froze, but he only tipped his hat and said, "That's a fine sound." Still, shadows lingered. Some nights she woke screaming, the terror clawing its way back. The girl would crawl into her bed and hold her until the sobs quieted. The man never said a word, but in the morning there'd be fresh bread on the table, stronger locks on the doors, and a fire burning warm. Seasons shifted. She stitched clothes for the girl, cooked meals that filled the house with warmth, and tended the garden with patient hands. The rancher watched her not as a man watching a servant but as one who had found something broken and dared not break it further. Slowly, she began to meet his eyes, to see not pity but respect. One evening, as the sun dipped low, the girl ran across the yard with a scraped knee, crying. Grace knelt, kissed the wound, and whispered, "You're brave." When she looked up, the rancher was watching from the porch. Their eyes met, and for the first time, she didn't look away. The girl tugged at her sleeve again, asking, "You'll stay forever, won't you?" Her throat tightened, the past threatening to choke her, but when she looked at the man, she saw no chains, no cages, only an open sky waiting. And for the first time in years, she believed she could belong. The ranch sat far from the nearest town, so far that silence itself seemed to hold dominion over the land. Morning always came quietly, with only the rooster's call and the wind moving through the tall grass. Grace rose earlier than the others, her body still tuned to survival, to vigilance, though no one here would strike her if she slowed. She moved carefully through the kitchen, her bare feet light on the wooden floor, as though each step was borrowed. She baked bread, stirring the flour with hands that had once trembled too much to hold even a cup. Now those same hands grew steadier by the day. The little girl would wake soon after, her hair wild, her smile unashamed. She never called Grace anything but Grace, as if the name had always belonged to her, stitched into her skin. When the girl climbed onto her lap at the breakfast table, Grace felt something deep inside unravel, an ache she had not dared to name. She had never thought of herself as a mother, never thought her body or soul capable of giving such comfort, but the child leaned against her as if she were the safest place in the world. The rancher entered last, shoulders broad against the morning light, his silence filling the room not with threat but steadiness. He would nod at Grace, always with the same quiet respect, and she would answer with a small smile. Their exchanges rarely went beyond a few words, yet within them lived an understanding that neither needed to explain. She washed his shirts, mended his coats, but it wasn't duty, it was her way of giving back, of saying thank you in stitches and soap. The land itself became a kind of companion. Grace learned the way the hills caught the sun at dawn, the way the cattle moved like shadows against the horizon, the way storms rolled in without warning, turning the sky into a bruised canvas. She found peace in these patterns, as though the world was reminding her that life could move forward, steady and unbroken. But not all days were quiet. Sometimes strangers rode through, cowhands looking for work, traders heading north. The first time a man tipped his hat too low and let his eyes linger, Grace froze, her breath caught in her throat. Memories surged back, rough hands, cruel voices, the weight of chains. She nearly dropped the basket she was carrying, her legs threatening to give out. But then she heard the rancher's voice, calm yet firm, cutting across the yard. "You've done your business. Move on." The men left, and only then did Grace breathe again. That night she sat by the fire, silent, her hands gripping her dress so tightly her knuckles turned white. The rancher said nothing, only poured her a cup of warm milk and set it on the table. She looked at it, then at him, and in his eyes she saw not pity but patience. She drank, her trembling slowing, and when the little girl curled up beside her, she let herself lean into that small comfort. The child's laughter became the music of the house. She dragged Grace into games, begged her to braid her hair, demanded she join in chasing chickens across the yard. Grace would laugh, softly at first, then louder, freer, until it startled her. She had forgotten what her own laughter sounded like. She began to sing more, humming while kneading dough, her voice filling the rooms. The rancher often paused in his work, listening quietly, never saying much but always seeming lighter for it. Still, shadows lingered at the edges of her days. She would see the scars on her wrists in the mirror, and they would remind her of the chains. Some nights, she dreamed of the wagon, the dust, the voices that had stripped her of her name. She woke drenched in sweat, clutching at the sheets. Each time, the girl would stir, crawl into her bed without question, and whisper, "You're safe, Grace. Daddy says you're safe." Those words, spoken by such a small voice, held more power than chains ever had. One afternoon in late spring, the rancher brought home a horse, a wild one with eyes full of fire. Grace stood at the fence, watching as the animal kicked and bucked. The rancher moved with patience, not force, speaking low, steadying the creature. Grace's chest tightened as she realized she understood the horse. Its wildness wasn't anger, it was fear, the instinct to fight every hand that reached out. When the horse finally stilled, trembling but no longer striking, she felt tears burn her eyes. The rancher caught her gaze, and for a moment, no words were needed. They both knew what she was thinking. She had been that horse. The girl grew bolder in her affection, declaring one night at supper, Grace should stay forever. "She's ours now." Grace nearly dropped her fork. The rancher didn't laugh, didn't scold the child, he only looked at Grace, his expression unreadable. Something stirred in her chest, a longing too dangerous to name, and she excused herself to the porch where the evening air cooled her flushed skin. She had to remind herself she was still a guest in this life, that belonging was not promised. And yet, every day made it harder to imagine leaving. The summer heat came heavy, but it was softened by small joys. The girl catching fireflies in jars, Grace hanging linens that smelled of sun, the rancher teaching them both how to ride. Grace was hesitant at first, gripping the saddle with fear, but the rancher's hand was steady at her back, his voice calm. "You won't fall," he said, and she believed him enough to loosen her grip. By the time the horse trotted gently around the yard, she was laughing, her hair loose in the wind, and the girls' delighted cheers rang louder than the crickets. There were moments when the world threatened to intrude. A letter arrived one day, carried by a man from town. The rancher read it at the table, his brow furrowing. Grace sat stiffly, her heart racing, afraid it might concern her past. But he folded it quietly and said nothing. Later she found him outside, staring across the fields. "Men don't always let go of what they think they own," he said softly, not looking at her. Her breath caught, terror curling in her belly, but his next words steadied her, "But you're not theirs. Not anymore. She wanted to thank him, but the words stuck in her throat, so she only nodded, her eyes shining with tears. Autumn brought cooler winds, golden leaves tumbling across the yard. Grace had grown stronger, her body no longer thin from neglect, her steps more certain. She sewed new dresses for herself, not because she had to but because she wanted to feel whole, to shape herself into someone she could recognize in the mirror. The little girl admired her constantly, declaring her beautiful, and sometimes Grace caught the rancher's gaze lingering too. When their eyes met, he would tip his hat or clear his throat, but the warmth in his look lingered with her long into the night. Winter settled heavy, with snow blanketing the fields and fire crackling in the hearth. Grace found herself at the heart of it all, cooking stews, mending blankets, singing the child to sleep. The ranch no longer felt like a place she had stumbled into, it felt like home. And yet, deep within her, fear whispered that it could all be taken away. She carried that fear silently, like a shadow stitched to her skin. One night, as the storm howled outside, the girl asked again, her eyes wide and earnest, "You'll never leave, will you, Grace?" The question pierced deeper than she expected. She brushed the child's hair back, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "I'll stay as long as I can." The rancher heard, though she hadn't meant for him to. Later, by the fire, he said quietly, "This house is stronger with you in it." She looked at him, her heart beating fast, and for the first time, she allowed herself to hope. The seasons would turn again. Shadows of the past would come and go, but Grace was no longer the chained woman in the wagon. She was a woman with a name, a voice, and a place at a table where she was wanted. And though she could not say it yet, she had begun to believe that the second life she had been given was hers to keep. The snow fell in thick silence, wrapping the ranch in white. The girl pressed her hands to the window, marveling at the frost painting its lacework across the glass. Grace stood behind her, pulling the shawl tighter around the child's shoulders. She had learned the girl hated the cold but loved the beauty of it, always begging to go outside, her laughter echoing across the frozen yard as she tried to catch flakes on her tongue. Grace often followed, her own boots crunching softly in the snow, though she moved slower, her gaze always scanning the horizon as if expecting danger to ride over the hills. That old vigilance had not left her. Perhaps it never would. But here, in this place, it no longer ruled her every breath. The rancher chopped wood each morning, his broad shoulders rising and falling with the steady rhythm of the axe. Grace sometimes watched from the porch, not because she was idle, but because the sight of him working so quietly, so uncomplainingly, stirred something deep in her. His steadiness had become her anchor. He never demanded gratitude, never reminded her of what she had been when she arrived. He simply gave, and in his giving, he had built her back up in ways she had not thought possible. She repaid him in small things, the meals she cooked, the house she kept, the gentle care she gave his daughter. Yet deep inside she wondered if it was enough. Could she ever be more than a shadow taking warmth from his fire? The nights of winter were the hardest. When the wind howled against the walls and the air outside was sharp as glass, memories crept in uninvited. She would dream of dark rooms and iron chains, of cruel laughter and her own voice breaking in her throat. She woke with her heart pounding, her breath shallow, certain she was back in the place she had been stolen to. It often took minutes before the warmth of the blankets, the sound of the little girl's breathing, reminded her she was safe. One night, when her sobs shook her body too violently to hide, she slipped from her bed and sat before the fire. The rancher, already awake, joined her without a word, placing a cup of tea in her trembling hands. "You don't have to speak of it," he said quietly. His gaze stayed on the flames, not on her, giving her the space to remain whole even in her brokenness. "But you can, if ever the weight is too heavy." She wanted to tell him everything, about the men who had taken her, about the cruelty, about the years lost, but her tongue refused. Instead she only whispered, "Sometimes I forget who I was before." He nodded, his expression unreadable, then said simply, "Then you make yourself new." The words sank into her like seed into soil. She thought of the name he had given her, Grace, and realized it was more than a kindness. It was a promise that she could become something entirely her own. When spring returned, the land softened. Snow melted into streams, wildflowers crept up through the fields, and with them came a lightness Grace had never known. She worked the soil beside the rancher, planting vegetables, her hands sinking into the earth as though she were burying the last remnants of her past. The girl ran barefoot through the fields, chasing butterflies, calling back to them with laughter that seemed to heal the air itself. Grace began to laugh with her, louder, freer. She discovered she loved the way the wind tugged at her hair, the way her dress billowed when she ran, the way her lungs burned with life when she dared to run beside the child. The rancher watched them sometimes, leaning against the fence with his arms crossed. He never interrupted, never called them frivolous, but there was a light in his eyes that Grace felt even when her back was turned. It unsettled her, not with fear, but with an ache she didn't know how to name. That ache deepened one evening when he reached for a jar high on the shelf and his hand brushed hers. The touch was brief, accidental, yet it sent heat rushing through her. She pulled back quickly, eyes downcast, but her heart kept pounding long into the night. She told herself not to hope. Men were dangerous, unpredictable. To trust one was to gamble with her soul. And yet, every day she saw him choose kindness, not only with her, but with his daughter, with the animals, with the land itself. His strength was not a weapon, but a shelter. He worked hard without complaint, spoke gently, and though he rarely smiled, when he did it softened his entire face. Grace caught herself longing to see that smile more often. Summer came, bringing long days of heat and the hum of cicadas in the grass. The girl grew taller, her legs tanned from running in the fields, her hair a mess of golden tangles. She followed Grace everywhere, asking endless questions about the world. "Do you think flowers talk to each other?" she asked once, holding a daisy up to Grace's cheek. Grace laughed softly, answering, "Maybe they do, but only in a language we've forgotten." The rancher overheard, shaking his head with a small smile. "You've filled her head with magic," he said later, his tone not reproachful but almost amused. Grace only shrugged, her lips curving upward. "Children need magic," she replied. "It's what teaches them hope." The rancher grew quiet at that, and for a long moment he only looked at her. His gaze was steady, unflinching, as though he were trying to memorize the way the evening light framed her face. Grace turned away quickly, her cheeks burning. But the memory of his eyes lingered. The days stretched long with work, tending cattle, repairing fences, hauling water, but they carried with them a rhythm that became comfort. Grace no longer flinched at every sound, no longer shrank when strangers passed the road. She found herself singing more often, her voice carrying over the fields as she hung laundry or swept the porch. Once, when she thought no one was listening, she sang a lullaby she remembered from her childhood. When she finished, the rancher appeared in the doorway, his hat in hand. "That was beautiful," he said simply, and left before she could answer. She stood frozen, her heart tangled between fear and longing. But the past did not let go so easily. One hot afternoon, riders came down the road, men with hard eyes and familiar cruelty in their faces. Grace saw them from the porch and felt her blood turn to ice. She knew those faces. She had prayed never to see them again. They dismounted, speaking loudly to the rancher, demanding supplies, claiming they had rights over the land. One of them let his gaze fall on her, a cruel smile curving his lips. Well, he drawled. "Didn't think we'd find our lost bird out here." Grace's knees nearly buckled. The world spun. She clutched the doorframe to keep from collapsing. The rancher stepped forward then, his body a wall between her and the men. His voice was calm but iron strong. "She's not yours. Leave." The men laughed, taunting him, threatening. Grace couldn't breathe, the weight of old terror suffocating her. But the rancher never wavered. His hand rested near his sidearm, though he didn't draw it. "You've had your say. Now get off my land," he said. Something in his tone, steady as stone, left no room for argument. After a tense silence, the men spat into the dirt, mounted their horses, and rode away. Grace collapsed once they were gone, her body shaking with sobs she could not control. The rancher knelt beside her, his hand hovering before finally resting on her shoulder. "They won't touch you," he said firmly. "Not while I breathe." His words cut through her panic like light through darkness. For the first time, she believed them. The weeks after were slow healing. She carried firmly. "Not while I breathe." His words cut through her panic like light through darkness. For the first time, she believed them. The weeks after were slow healing. She carried the fear like a wound, tender and raw, but the rancher's presence steadied her. He added stronger locks to the doors, walked the perimeters each evening, and though he never said it outright, she knew he was watching for her safety. She hated the thought of being a burden, yet every time she tried to apologize, he silenced her with a simple truth: "You don't owe me." What she did owe, she gave freely in her care for the home. She cooked, cleaned, taught the girl letters and stories, made the house not only livable but warm. And slowly, she realized she was not a guest anymore. She belonged here. Not because she was chained by necessity, but because she was wanted. Autumn came again, crisp air filling the fields. One evening, while they all sat by the fire, the girl curled into Grace's lap, drifting to sleep. Grace stroked her hair gently, humming softly. The rancher watched them quietly, his eyes unreadable. After a long silence, he spoke, his voice low. "She's happier with you here. I am too." Grace looked at him, her heart hammering. She wanted to answer, but fear caught her tongue. To admit what she felt, that this place had become more than shelter, that this man had become more than protector, was to risk everything. So she only whispered, "I'm grateful." But deep inside, she knew gratitude was only part of it. What had taken root was something stronger, something dangerous and beautiful. As the nights grew longer, she found herself daring to dream, not of escape, but of staying. Not of survival, but of living. The past would always be a scar, but scars, she realized, were proof of healing. She had a name, a voice, a place at the table. And though she had not yet spoken the words aloud, she had found love, not the kind forced by chains, but the kind freely chosen. And with each passing day, she let herself believe it could last. The days shortened again, and the land seemed to fold into itself as winter crept across the fields. The ranch was steady, the rhythms of life unbroken, yet Grace carried with her the echo of that afternoon when the men had come. She moved through her days with purpose, but at night, when the world grew silent, she would sometimes hear their voices in her mind, sharp as knives, whispering that they could still return. But alongside the fear was something stronger, something she had not had before, the memory of the rancher's voice, unwavering as he stood between her and danger. His promise, spoken without hesitation, "Not while I breathe," echoed louder than the fear. It carried her through the dark nights, teaching her to believe that perhaps the world could give her more than chains and survival. The girl's affection tethered her, grounding her in ways she could not have imagined. She called for Grace first thing each morning, clung to her hand when they walked into town, curled against her at night as though she belonged in her arms. Grace found herself moving through each day with a sense of responsibility, not the forced duty of captivity, but the chosen devotion of love. She had not asked for this child, yet she found herself watching over her as though she were her own flesh and blood. She thought often of what it meant to be a mother, of how simple moments, the wiping of a tear, the brushing of hair, the soothing of nightmares, became acts that stitched two souls together. And though she had never borne a child, though her body carried the scars of all it had endured, she knew now that motherhood was not only birth, but nurture. The rancher watched them both with a quietness that sometimes unsettled her. His eyes, steady and observant, seemed always to hold back words he never spoke. He did not intrude upon their closeness, nor did he demand from her anything more than she chose to give. But his presence filled every corner of her days. He was there in the mornings, setting out before dawn to mend fences or care for the herd. He was there in the evenings, silent at the table yet grounding the room with his steadiness. He was there in the quiet nights, when she woke trembling from dreams of chains, his shadow sitting by the fire, keeping watch. She realized she had grown to depend on him, not out of fear or necessity, but because his very being was a reminder that kindness could be strength, and that safety could be real. But it frightened her, too. To depend was to risk losing. She had lost everything once, and the thought of losing again was almost unbearable. Still, the more she tried to resist the pull of her heart, the deeper it seemed to grow. It wasn't sudden. It had been building all along, through the meals shared, through the laughter of the child, through the quiet exchanges of glances across the table. Love had slipped into her like a tide, so slowly she hadn't noticed until she was already drowning in it. The girl, in her innocence, seemed to sense what Grace could not say. She would often take Grace's hand in one of hers and her father's in the other, pulling them together with a smile. "We're a family," she declared one evening, her voice so certain that Grace's heart tightened painfully. She dared not meet the rancher's eyes then, afraid of what she might see, either rejection or the truth she longed for but feared. Instead, she only squeezed the girl's hand and whispered, "Yes, we are." The turning point came one late winter afternoon, when the sun dipped low behind the hills and cast long shadows across the yard. Grace had been gathering laundry from the line when she saw a figure riding in the distance. Her heart seized. For a breathless moment, she thought the past had returned to claim her. The rancher came to her side, his gaze sharp on the horizon, his body tense and ready. But it was only a messenger, carrying word from town. Still, the fear that had risen inside her did not leave. That night, she sat awake long after the others slept, staring into the flames. When the rancher joined her, she did not look at him, afraid that if she spoke, her fear would spill out too loudly. But he sat in silence, and slowly, the stillness of his presence calmed her. "You've built something here," she said finally, her voice low. "Something I never thought I'd find. But what if it's taken away?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he poked at the fire, watching the sparks rise and fade. Then he spoke, his words deliberate and steady. "Life always has a way of testing what we value. But nothing worth keeping comes without risk." His eyes met hers then, holding her gaze with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I can't promise the world won't try to take. But I promise I'll fight to keep it." For the first time, she didn't look away. She let herself see the truth in his eyes, the unspoken feelings that had lingered between them. And she let herself hope. Spring brought renewal, as it always did. The land turned green, the streams swelled, and with them came a lightness in Grace's steps. She laughed more easily, sang without fear of being overheard, worked in the garden with a joy that surprised even herself. She began to believe in a future, not just for the child, not just for survival, but for herself. And though she never said it aloud, her heart had begun to weave itself into the fabric of the ranch, into the lives of the two who had given her a second life. But the world does not leave scars untested. It was late one afternoon when the shadows of her past rode back into her life. She heard the horses before she saw them, the thunder of hooves carrying with it the taste of dread. She froze where she stood, the basket slipping from her hands, as the riders appeared at the edge of the yard. The same men, their eyes sharp with malice, their voices coarse with laughter. They had come back, and this time, they carried the weight of determination. The rancher stepped forward, his stance unyielding, his hand near his weapon. Grace felt her blood run cold, fear screaming through her veins. She wanted to run, to hide, but her feet would not move. The men shouted claims, spoke of debts, spoke of ownership, as though she were still nothing more than a body to be used, a name to be erased. Her past roared back in that moment, so loud she could barely breathe. But then the rancher's voice cut through, calm and firm as stone. "She's not yours. She never was. And she never will be." His words, spoken with such certainty, shattered the chains that memory had tightened around her throat. He stood between her and the men, his presence a shield, his voice a vow. When the confrontation ended, when the men, faced with his resolve, turned and rode away, Grace collapsed into tears. But this time, they were not tears of fear alone. They were tears of release. That night, when the child slept soundly in her bed, Grace sat with the rancher by the fire. The silence between them was thick, full of words unspoken. Finally, she whispered, "I thought I'd never escape them. Even when I came here, even when you gave me a name, I thought part of me would always belong to them. But today I believed you." He looked at her then, his eyes steady. "You don't belong to them," he said simply. "You belong where you choose." His gaze lingered, and in that moment, she felt the truth settle deep inside her. For the first time in her life, she could choose. Her choice came not in grand declarations, but in the small ways she began to live. She stood taller, spoke with confidence, laughed without restraint. She cared for the child with the devotion of a mother, tended the ranch with the diligence of a partner. And slowly, she allowed herself to give her heart, to the land, to the child, to the man who had given her freedom not by taking control, but by offering it. The seasons turned once more. Summer brought long days of work and evenings of quiet joy. The child grew, her laughter carrying through the fields like music. The ranch thrived, not just with crops and cattle, but with life and warmth. Grace found herself standing on the porch one evening, watching the sun set behind the hills, the man beside her, the child playing in the yard. She felt a peace she had never known, a peace that came not from forgetting the past but from overcoming it. When the child ran to her, throwing her arms around her waist and calling her, "Mama," without hesitation, Grace's heart swelled with a love so fierce it nearly broke her. She looked at the rancher then, her eyes brimming with tears, and for once, she did not hide. He held her gaze. And though no words were spoken, everything was understood. Her life had begun again here, not with chains, but with freedom. Not with fear, but with love. And though the scars of her past would always remain, they no longer defined her. She had been given a dress, a name, a second life, and she had chosen to claim it. And in that choice, she found herself whole.